Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Edgerly with the Alzheimer's Association, coming to you today from AAIC 2018 here in Chicago. And I'm so proud to introduce my colleague, Dan Lawler, Executive Director for the Desert Southwest Chapter. Dan's going to start us off today with a bit of an update.
It is. This has been an exciting day 2 of AAIC out here. And I'm going to share a little bit about what's been going on in the clinical trial realm. We actually had representatives from the National Institutes of Aging, from the National Institutes of Health, with facilitation by the association itself, to talk about progress with the National Strategy for Recruitment and Participation in Alzheimer's Disease Clinical Research. Now, this is an effort outlining practical, proactive approaches to help study sites and researchers recruit and train individuals to participate in clinical research. The new national strategy, which is a little bit of a work in progress though, is an outgrowth of the national plan to address Alzheimer's disease, which calls for expanding research aimed at preventing and treating Alzheimer's. Namely, we want to really increase enrollment in clinical trials through community and national and international outreach. And then we also want to increase the diversification of participation in clinical trials, which are two important things. I think as we've learned here and we've known, one of the biggest challenges to developing treatments and to learning about this disease is just participation in clinical trials. And so the more people that can be involved, whether it be through reaching out or through enrolling in Trial Match, the association's clinical trial program, the more we can help advance our knowledge of this disease and hopefully develop treatments and one day a cure.
Awesome, great. So you've probably heard this before, but the number one barrier to advances in Alzheimer's science has been funding. Mm-hmm. We've been working on that and having some successes, but the number 2 barrier is what Dan was just talking about, subjects. So I've volunteered, Dan's volunteered. How about you? So there's lots of ways to get involved. Let me share with you some of the new things that we learned today, and I need my reading glasses, unlike Dan. And again, we're coming to you from Chicago at AAIC 2018. If you're just joining us, welcome. We're glad to have you. You may have already heard that there are over 5,600 scientists here and over 52% are women. So I wanted to talk about girl power for a little bit, and some of the things that we've been learning specifically affect the women in our lives, the women in your life, in terms of how Alzheimer's disproportionately affects women. And you've probably heard this before, but 2/3 of all people with Alzheimer's are women. And we're learning more and more about why that might be, and potentially some things that we as women might need to do to affect our risk of developing Alzheimer's. So let me share some of that with you. First off, we learned a little bit more about estrogen, and as a woman who is now regularly experiencing hot flashes, I have to tell you I was listening very closely to the estrogen reports because I want this stuff, ladies. This is what I am eager to start. But I haven't done that because there have been mixed reports about whether estrogen is good for you in terms of maybe reducing your risk of Alzheimer's, or actually the opposite. And so I've been very cautious, and I imagine some of you may have as well. What we learned today is that there's some evidence to suggest that it may be not so dangerous, not so risky to go on estrogen, and that short-term use of estrogen could be helpful for women who are experiencing menopause. So they're clarifying that the age that you go on estrogen, the kind of estrogen, and how long you're going on the estrogen for makes a difference. So check that out. I won't go into all the details, but timing matters, length of time, and the type of estrogen. But maybe it's not so bad after all, which is wonderful news in my world. So the other thing they talked about is women and childbirth, and this was pretty interesting and almost a little surprising. They said that women who've had 3 or more children seem to have a lower risk of Alzheimer's, which I might have thought maybe lots and lots of children could, I don't know, drive you crazy a little bit sometimes and cause stress. But in fact, it appears to be a positive thing in terms of brain health. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, though, they did find that women who either had fewer children or even women who'd had miscarriages seemed to have a higher risk. So they found at Kaiser Permanente in Northern California, a very large study, that women who'd had 3 or more miscarriages seemed to have a higher risk. So I want to just note that that's pretty heavy message to hear. For those of you who've experienced miscarriages, I know it's a very personal thing, and what the scientists said is, if you know you're in this group, don't give up hope. There are other things that we can be doing to offset that risk, and that's where I wanted to go now, is what can we do to potentially up the odds of maintaining our brain health as we get older. And you could probably say, what's the top thing you think of to maintain brain health?
I think staying socially active and eating well.
Eating well, good. Like a Mediterranean diet, maybe.
Mediterranean diet.
Socially engaged, cognitively engaged.
Correct.
And the big one in my mind is exercise. And so we keep hearing this, that making sure that we're working out. We heard from Dr. Laura Baker today on a special panel. She said at least 3 days a week and at least 30 minutes, and I've actually heard her say higher than that before, 45 minutes. So we need to do the things we can to maintain our cognitive health. Some other things they've been talking about are addressing hypertension. So if you have uncontrolled high blood pressure, there are multiple studies that are saying you really want to tighten that up, and that can make a difference. Also diabetes, making sure that you control your diabetes well to mitigate that risk. So I won't go through all of them, but let me share with you that the researchers are telling us that 30% of dementia could potentially be prevented with all of us addressing our risk factors. And so the good news is there's something we can do about it. The bad news is you got to do it. And that's hard.
True.
Diane wants to know if it's hereditary.
Yes. Thank you, Diane. So let me repeat that question. Is Alzheimer's hereditary? I'm going to specify is Alzheimer's hereditary, because there's lots of different types of dementia, and the hereditary nature of them, each different type of dementia varies. But
Correct.
yes, certainly family history of Alzheimer's is a risk factor. And so I'll use myself as an example. My mother has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So what I know about that is I'm, by virtue of her having Alzheimer's, at risk of potentially inheriting a gene called the ApoE4 gene.
Correct.
And if I have one copy of that gene as a woman, my risk of Alzheimer's is probably about twice as much. If I happen to get 2 copies of this gene, let's say one from my dad and one from my mom, my risk of Alzheimer's could be 8 to 10 times higher. So we know that having a first-degree relative raises our risk, but I also want to say that it's very similar to like heart disease, where you know if your mom had heart disease, you have higher risk. Does it mean you will definitely get heart disease? No. Same is true for Alzheimer's. If Dan's mom has Alzheimer's, he knows he's got higher risk, but it doesn't mean he's guaranteed to get it. And so there's certainly other types of genetic mutations that are pretty rare, and so probably, hopefully, that's not what you're dealing with, Diane. But check out online. We have great information about genetics and Alzheimer's on our website at alz.org, and I encourage you to check that out. So thank you for the question. Let's see, I wanted to maybe just end here by talking about what's coming up. So there's been a lot of exciting discussion about biomarkers, and those of you who've seen me do this before have heard me talk about this, but a biomarker is where there's an objective test, kind of like blood pressure. You know, you go and you get your blood pressure taken. That's a biomarker. That's a measure of blood pressure, which may be a measure of heart disease. And so we need that in Alzheimer's, some easy measure. So the scientists here are so excited about a couple of different approaches. One is cerebrospinal fluid sampling. And this is where they take a small sample of your cerebrospinal fluid and they can actually detect the amyloid protein in it or not. And so based on those results, they're able to potentially get to the point where they can tell maybe who has Alzheimer's from those who don't, or even who's at risk of developing Alzheimer's. So that's been exciting. We're going to hear more about that. We're also going to hear more about the potential for blood tests. And I was at some really interesting meetings where the researchers are hopeful that we will get to that point, maybe even as soon as 5 years from now. That would be huge. Think about how many of you have struggled to get a diagnosis for your loved one. Imagine if we had a blood test. So we'll hear more about that. And the biggest news that's coming out is Wednesday. Dan and I are going to be there in the front row to hear this, hopefully. And it's of a drug called BAN 2401. And it is a BACE inhibitor. So what is that? Well, a BACE inhibitor is trying to address amyloid. You've probably heard of amyloid, this sticky protein in the brain associated with Alzheimer's. And what a BACE inhibitor does is it tries to stop that from forming. So there's a whole lot of buzz here. Everyone is talking about this session on Wednesday. So check it out. We'll have a session for you then. We'll bring you the news and tell you what we learn when we learn it. Nobody knows what the results are, but the buzz is exciting. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Dan.
Thank
for
you. It was
your
my
part.
first one ever.
Yeah, awesome. And tune in again. We'll have another one coming up. But thank you for joining us at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference. Take care,
you.
everybody. Bye.